We live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far. H.P. Lovecraft. Caverloft Plantation, Okershot, Louisiana, November 9th, 2007, 11:39 p.m. Everyone had known of the Dogma. It was practically a legend amongst the Order of the Ninth Scorpion. The Dogma Ishitarum ult Krelig. It literally meant the War of Ishitarum and Krelig. Ishitarum was an ancient world of towering spires and sprawling deserts. Ishitarum was known as the Endless Barrens, or the Frozen Desert lost to time. Home to the Cravon Ishitar, Ishitarum was a place of beauty, shining gold on silent ember-glown evenings. Krelig was another matter entirely. Krelig, known also by its less attractive title of the Swamplands, was a toxic sludge pit, crawling and slithering with different abominations of varying proportions. Abominations like the Kyrell and the Exquox. Worst of all were the Dogma Ishitar, mutated, atrophied tossaways of the Cravon Ishitar. There was also talk of another realm, a dimension known as the Abysm. The bottom layer of the Citadels of Chaos, the Abysm was home to the worst entities ever known to the universe. The Nine Who Walk, the Umbral Consciousness, the Faceless Lords, Dalan, and the Shadow Mother. All reside imprisoned within the Abysm as told in the accursed pages of the Necronomicon. The Abysm was the Cravon Ishitar equivalent of Hell, and the Order of the Ninth Scorpion wanted to open the gates of the Abysm. Quentin Caverloft stood in front of his full-body mirror, muttering to himself, his crimson robes fluttering in the soft breeze let in by the open balcony doors. Tonight will be the night, he thought. Tonight we will open the way, and nothing will stop us. 11:54 p.m. Lord Caverloft, Harry de Moy addressed the High Priest of the Order of the Ninth Scorpion. The gate of Yog-Sothoth has been prepared. The sacrifice is ready. Shall we proceed? Caverloft nodded, raising the hood of his robe over his head. Both men descended down the stairs toward the sub-level basement where the ceremony was being held. Once both de Moy and Caverloft had entered the basement, the door was closed and locked firmly. The place they had entered could hardly be called a basement. The word cathedral was more appropriate. The chamber was circular, and the dim lighting provided by candles gave the room a more sinister air. In the very center stood a statue of something. It resembled a man with insectile appendages on its torso. Its head was that of an ungodly cephalopod caricature. Its arms were great crab-like pincers. Below the heathen idol sat a stonework dais. Atop that lay an unconscious man. Well up to a dozen men and women resided in the chamber, all dressed in scarlet robes and masks of dirty cloth. A man stood by the dais, holding a ceremonial dagger, stained and rusted with years of blood. The unconscious man stirred, groaning at the pain in the back of his head. His eyes fluttered open. 11:58 p.m. Caverloft took his place before the raised dais and outstretched his arms. We are gathered here tonight to herald our masters into this plane of existence. From the blood of the mortal shall the Abysm be opened, and our masters will walk this world as they once did. We will be heralded as the saviors of the Dark Ones. The Ninth Scorpion will rise. The cultists cheered at Caverloft's words. The man bound to the altar struggled to no avail. Caverloft began chanting in some strange language as the man beside him slowly began to raise the blood-stained dagger. The rest of the cult began to chant as well. As Caverloft's chanting reached its fever pitch, the rest of the cult began to shout, and some of them started dancing. The candles flickered as the cultists danced wildly, and Caverloft shouted in tongues. The bound man screamed through the cloth covering his mouth as the dagger plunged downward. silencing his fearful wails. 12 a.m. The candles blew out as the screaming stopped. The chanting had ended, and everyone had stopped dancing. Everything had gone quiet and dark. The only sound that could be heard was the breathing of Caverloft, winded from shouting his cacodemoniacal sermons. The darkness was impenetrable, the silence unbroken. Suddenly, from the altar, shone a gold light. The light seemed to be emanating from the blood of the sacrifice. The light grew brighter as Caverloft watched, wide-eyed. Ethereal wisps of golden light stretched out from the altar. They touched the unlit candles, and flames burst on the wicks. Caverloft made an attempt to touch the light, but the tendrils withdrew and whipped around like angry snakes, striking at those unlucky enough to be close to the altar. Several people were slammed against the walls as the golden wisps flew around the chamber, pushing cultists into different directions. Harry DeMoy snatched up a bucket of water and raced toward the altar. Before the tendrils could catch him, DeMoy upended the bucket atop the glowing blood. The water washed away the gore, and the golden glow faded. Along with it went the golden tendrils. Caverloft stood up, panting. The candlelight made every shadow dance and flicker.
"Harry!"
he shouted. DeMoy came striding over.
"What was that?"
DeMoy asked, flustered. A look that had never been on Caverloft's face before now appeared. That look was fear.
"I don't know,"
he said in a hoarse whisper.
"You don't suppose it was him, do you?"
Caverloft knew what DeMoy was referring to. The golden glow, the ethereal tentacles. It couldn't be. That was a myth. There was no such thing as the Pale Physician. It couldn't be true. Could it? Caverloft's fears were interrupted by a scream. The scream was coming from one of the cultists, except said cultist was levitating high above the rest of the Order of the Ninth Scorpion. DeMoy recognized the cultist. It was Jeffrey Beavers. Jeffrey flailed around, wailing and crying.
"What's happening?"
Caverloft shouted.
"Help me!"
Jeffrey shouted before his head snapped to the left, and his screams turned to tortured gurgles. Jeffrey's body dropped to the floor with a sickening crunch. Inside the chamber, there was nothing but panic. Cultists flew in different directions. One was thrust up and slammed against the ceiling, while another was mashed into the floor by some unseen abomination. The invisible force slaughtered everything in sight.
"Lord Caverloft!"
Harry DeMoy shouted past the screams of terror. Caverloft tried to open the locked door, but to no avail.
"There's a key beside the—"
DeMoy did not finish as he was snatched up from the ground and held high up in the air. Caverloft stood helpless as DeMoy screamed. Caverloft gasped when DeMoy's head caved in on itself. Blood erupted as DeMoy's body fell to the floor. Most of the cult were eviscerated and piled haphazardly into different piles. Caverloft ran around the room like a headless chicken until something fell on top of him, and the world went dark. Caverloft Plantation, Okershot, Louisiana, November 10th, 2007, 2:07 a.m. Quentin Caverloft awoke in darkness. The smell was atrocious, a mix of iron and feces. He tried to cover his face, but realized he couldn't move. He began to panic. Was he buried alive? He tried to move again, with more success this time. He pushed several bodies and dismembered limbs off of his person. He stood up, shaking. He had never seen such horror. He gazed around the chamber, seeing all the mangled corpses littering the floor. He couldn't believe it. What had they done? He stumbled toward the door. Still locked. He had to find the key. He staggered towards the altar. Strange, he didn't remember the body of the sacrifice being arranged in that position. His eyes were closed. His arms were crossed, and his body was no longer bound to the altar. It looked as if the corpse had been arranged in this position with loving hands and intention. That was when Caverloft heard the stomping. He spun around. He looked at the floor. In the gathered blood, he could see footprints. inhuman footprints. Large footprints. Caverloft noticed that the prints were being left by feet with only 3 toes. Toes that ended in claws, and whatever was making them was coming closer. Caverloft tried to run but was snatched up into the air by unseen hands. He sat dangling above the ground, flailing his arms and legs. He felt something stab into his torso. The pain was unbearable. He cried and flailed his arms. He heard a low growling. He whipped his head toward the sound. The very last thing he saw was the golden glow of 2 ginormous eyes. The house reverberated with the sounds of Quentin Caverloft's tortured screams. The Order was dead, but the door was open. The gates of hell had been unlocked, and the ancient horrors had awoken. Caged in the dead abyss, they would crawl their way out from the darkness and into the sunlit worlds. Ancient evils, from beyond the veil, would tear their path back into the universe. And they must be stopped. At any cost.